la cruda realidad que viven los inmigrantes indocumentados en su viaje.
Protesters block a busload to the undocumented immigrants.
Television news programs around the world 1 year ago reported on the estimated 65,000 Central Americans flooding across the U.S. border from Texas to California, seeking political asylum from an explosion of violence from street gangs and drug traffickers in El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras. Their arrival in the U.S. protested by some American citizens demanding that they return to their countries. In the years since, many of these Central Americans have yet to receive political asylum in the U.S. because immigration courts here are said to be backed up with thousands of other asylum cases. And still thousands more Central Americans remain stuck living in limbo on the Mexican side of the border, too frightened to return to their own countries, seeking protection behind lock and key at migrant shelters up and down the U.S.-Mexico border. Maria is one such migrant, a 19-year-old single mother forced to flee Guatemala, she says, when kidnappers threatened to take her from her family, asking CCTV not to film her face.
Sí, no quiero, lo que pasa es que allá, como le digo, en mi país hay mucha violencia y si me ven, ¿verdad? Entonces pueden tremer contra mi familia, pueden atacar a mi familia.
Penniless, with no legal documents to work in Mexico, Maria says she was raped by a man here who had promised to smuggle her safely into the U.S. The only thing keeping her from losing all hope, she says, is her 4-year-old daughter with her family back home in Guatemala.
Corazón para mi bebé. La extraño con toda el alma. Quisiera tenerla conmigo para abrazarla y decirle cuánto la quiero. Y algún día regresaré con ellos y estaremos juntos para toda la vida.
Jose is another young Guatemalan living in limbo here in Mexico, working as a cook at a migrant shelter in exchange for food and lodging. Jose says he fled Guatemala with his 2 younger brothers, arriving at this YMCA in Tijuana with nothing, confirms YMCA director Uriel Gonzalez.
3 brothers that we received from Guatemala, they had a rough life. Their family was involved in some criminal activities. Both of her parents died.
Jose says his father and mother were mid-level cocaine traffickers for Colombians. Both murdered, shot dead by a rival Guatemalan drug gang, says Jose, in front of him and his brothers.
Pues yo no tuve otra alternativa de salir. Pues tuvimos que salir de mi país para acá porque nos andaban buscando, nos perseguían. Porque mis papás estuvieron involucrados en el narcotráfico.
They were looking for their sons, and they had to run away from Guatemala. The oldest brother received the asylum in Mexico, but the youngest ones didn't receive it.
Jose remains here alone now after helping his 2 younger brothers cross illegally into the U.S. to live with relatives there. And because he's been granted asylum in Mexico, it's uncertain he'll ever see his brothers again in the U.S.
So we have the separation of the 3 brothers, because when you have the asylum in a country, you cannot request another asylum in another country, because you already have one.
Jose says he hopes to leave this shelter one day and find a paying job somewhere in Mexico as a chef.
Yo quiero cambiar, pues quiero ser una persona diferente, ser ejemplo en la sociedad, pues y más que todo en la cocina. Yo creo que yo tengo el talento para ser un chef.
And all these kids, all these teenagers, could be involved or could be sold to other groups. Sex trade, forced labor, you name it, could happen. And it happens, unfortunately. For every kid that is traveling without the companionship of an adult, a family member, there's behind a whole industry of smugglers. And the smugglers don't care about humanity. Their business is to make money. How? They don't care.
My name is Enrique Morones. Okay. And I'm with Border Angels.
Enrique Morones, the president and founder of Border Angels, a nonprofit humanitarian organization at the forefront of protecting the human rights of undocumented immigrants, says that the U.S. government needs to help Central Americans by enabling them to apply for U.S. political asylum while still in their beleaguered countries.
In El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. So if I'm that father that's scared that my child is going to be forced to join a gang or they're going to chop his head off, those are things that are really happening, I can apply for asylum right there in El Salvador and not have to travel through Mexico where you might be kidnapped, where you have to deal with these issues as well. They can decide right there in El Salvador, Guatemala, or Honduras, you get a visa or you don't get a visa. So they can find out right now.
Recently, Morones and other human rights volunteers on a blistering summer day walked the long 1.5-mile dirt road that's covered in raw sewage, as warned on these signs, a road that currently is the only route made available for Hispanic American citizens wanting to visit their deported loved ones at this U.S. patrolled security zone known as Friendship Park. This elderly visitor, a childhood victim of polio, made the hour-long walk only to be initially turned away by a U.S. border agent from visiting his deported loved ones. He was told only 25 visitors at a time are allowed, and he must wait his turn.
What did she tell you?
Oh, that they're at full capacity.
Did you walk here?
Yeah.
Morones on this day brings crosses to the beach here, raising one of them in solidarity with deported immigrants raising their crosses through the border wall on the Mexican side. Crosses, Morones says, that symbolize the millions of undocumented immigrants who've been deported from the U.S. over the years. The crosses painted with messages in Spanish, telling immigrants they're not alone and not forgotten. Nor, says Morones, are the thousands more who've died attempting to make it around this wall.
The U.S. government does not practice what it preaches. It likes to go around the world telling people to practice human rights, yet they have a wall that's led to the death of 11,000 people. They don't have asylum cases being accepted in most cases. Those 65,000 children that I talked about, very few of them will get asylum. The United States government actually gives more asylum per capita to people from Venezuela, from Iraq, from Iran, from North Korea, countries that they have some sort of a not positive relationship with. But when you're talking about children from Central America or from Mexico, they don't give them asylum. For the overwhelming majority, they don't get to stay and they're sent back. That's not what this country is about. That's not what it likes to tell the world, but that's what's taking place right now.
And as for last year's wave of Central American migrants still seeking asylum in the U.S. and Mexico, they continue to have a difficult wait to learn their fate, seemingly adrift in a sea of uncertainty.